The problem with wanting communication to be clear and concise is that you demand a standard that doesn't give people a chance, or even yourself rather, a chance to figure out what that context is supposed to be without having to need a survey of questions or a survey of context that comes outside of what is said to expand on. You wouldn't need that in the first place if you just gave people a chance to not even elaborate, because this is also what falls into that trap. The clear and concise trap being that not everyone should, not even can, because the can doesn't mean should paradigm is really fucked up in itself. I never wanted to fall for that trap myself. And I call them traps because I want to see if that will elicit a response from myself, let alone people how that will be logically perceived. But the clear and concise paradigm is not something that I still think would be the vast majority of people seeing that way. Because before I would define clear and concise being a vast majority, everyone thinks that everyone else wants clear and concise communication. They probably don't. Not even people who still mostly think that way probably do. You don't want to ever have a situation where you can only get the information you need and nothing else, and the information that makes sense and nothing else. You want to have some mystery, riddles. You want to have some plethoras and abundances of information, whether it's useful or not. Because then you can distinguish the information by comparing and contrasting what is or isn't relevant to you or even sensible to you. And that's not even just describing how I think. That's not even just describing how other people think either. Personally, however, I would rather have some of those nonsensical and sensical things being useful in themselves, however chaotic that sounds. Because the reasonable thing about that, this is why I'm a pro-materialist, by the way. I'm a pro-materialist because materialism doesn't have to only be bad or good. The ideal approach to this isn't so much if you can avoid being a person who can actually make the most out of what they have. Not even the other neutral approach to this, which is when you can avoid seeing it as good or bad what you have. But my approach is to make sure that you know that everything you do or do not have doesn't have to be your downfall or your inevitable success. There is a way to go with this in an even more insightful way, but the one I made careful so far was to have the things that you do use or have interact with one another so that when they compare and contrast with each other, they don't have to be overcomplicated or overcounted for. They can still be their own treasure and their own form of use, even without being useful. You can have this happen in the same form of communication. Like as with physical items in the real world, you can too also have this with communication. How this would work is that, yes, maybe English language in particular, the English language, has too many rules or too few rules, maybe too few rules mostly anyways, or in other languages. And people will only want to learn languages to have more forms of communication, not so much to study a beauty of something like Welsh or sign language, or to have a different approach to things that makes things more flexible. When you think about how the brain works, how it flexes on neurons and shit, that I'm not even describing properly, but how it learns things because of the novelty behind certain things, and how novelty can also be its own catch-22 because of how that works with addiction, particularly novelty. How novelty really fucks with you sometimes, if not half the time. But really, how the brain works seems to be a really interesting way to approach how you learn new things and how you even do things insightfully. If you want to know how I'm an insightful person without even connecting with the world properly, that's kind of self-explanatory. By not connecting to the world properly, I have been forced to become even more insightful than I already am. And my lack of communication sometimes even gives me a chance to communicate with myself, which is a really rare way to approach feeling like you have to do everything for a reason or become the most professional person of all time, etc., etc., etc. That being said, I wish I could still communicate with other people more, but I don't want to do that through clear, concise manners all the damn time, at least. I want to be able to communicate with myself and other people without sacrificing who I am or even sacrificing what other people value. And to do that, if communication has to be clear and concise at least part of the time, I'm willing to take that sacrifice. And yes, it will be a sacrifice that I done. But I still need to be who I am, whether being a limitation or being in a acceptable mannerism of knowing what is being said has to be at play. It's not fun to know that people have a standard that they don't want to compromise when, for all who knows, or even if anyone knows, particularly anyone, not just me, knows that there's a better way of doing it, if not only a better way of doing it, which sounds just as objectively scrutinized as them. That's a good phrase, actually. Objective scrutiny. Is it really objective? Is it really scrutinable? Well, but I don't want to summarize every damn thing I say. I don't want to have to be, and this sounds like scummy, but it's like to only say a certain number of words and just say them in a way that just specifically built just so that people can understand them, if it even includes you, or vice versa. I don't think communication is only about being understood and being resourceful. There has to be a better outlet for this. There has to be a better way of coming through with this stuff. Knowing that there are times in entertainment, where yes, in entertainment, not just the boredom releasing of that entertainment, but even uses in entertainment that don't have to be woo-woo or, entertainment being that they have different mediums of communication throughout comic books and movies and animated series and actual novel books, light novels, the different mediums, even just pictures and art in the museum. You can have these in audiobooks too, like in the music. You have all these different mediums of communication, in particular to the point of this video. They all exist because you know how to express, at least I hope you would, as a director or whatever, of those creative mediums, that each of these mediums have different approaches that cannot be made the same way. And if you comply to the idea that they have to be expressed in the same way, you fall into the same popular meme trap that a book turning into a movie not succeeding or not making sense or not being likable is a flaw rather than an actual mistake, because those don't have to be conflated even then. What I mean by that is that it was never supposed to completely correlate. They were different meanings in the first place. They didn't have to appeal to the same audiences, nor tell the same stories, nor even be effective the same way. They were different mediums. And to think otherwise is asinine, in my words, because I've been told what's asinine and what isn't asinine. I don't always believe in that anyways, but so therefore I don't always use those words. But I will use that word to say that, yeah, it's kind of stupid to think that you need a movie to communicate the exact same way as a book from its predecessor. And this is coming back into my argument about the communication not being concurrent and concise. In a similar fashion, it never was meant to only be clear and concise. That is the major flaw of wanting a manner of communication to be a standard comes with. You don't have to be clear and concise in every single possible way, in every single situation. If that was a rule of thumb for a medium of communication, like say, a novel, we have novels, novellas, short stories, essays, written responses, maximum of 140 characters, or nowadays 280 characters on Twitter, etc. Any form of written communication that was limited isn't so much a limit of liberation and freedom and rights. I guess that would be an over-exaggeration. But to actually think that you need to be resourceful in every single situation, just because the essay thing is only an example of how to communicate differently, doesn't mean that you can only do that every single time, all the time, only to make sure of that. You have a standard to be resourceful because of how much it counts sometimes. That's maybe a flawed argument in itself, but I would say that as a pro-materialist, I don't think that having enough things being, even for me, as someone like me who does everything for a reason, wants to be pro-impartial all the time, etc., I'm a pro-materialist because I know that comparing and contrasting multiple items, or even just one item by itself, however useful that is, controversial inside itself. But the insightful approach is to make sure that rather than only having things be useful if they are useful, or realizing that that everything you have isn't supposed to be good or bad in particular, but the insightful approach I have nowadays is to have things compare and contrast with one another, both physical and imagined, that don't have to be useless just because there's too many. And they don't have to be useless just because they're not clarified. And they don't have to be something that you use to make a communication successful just because communication involves that manner of thinking.